How y'all doing? For this book review is a book that many people may know about from Gary Gygax, creator of Dungeons & Dragons Appendix N. And it's an unusual one. I first came aware of this from the Dungeon Dive's secondary channel, All Fiction is Fantasy. And you look at it, it looks like a typical sword and sorcery, heroic fantasy type story. But it isn't. This is where the cover does deceive you. And that is The Shadow People by Margaret St. Published in 1969. And if you read this, as odd as it is, you understand the elements from this book and how Gary Gygax used it for Dungeons & Dragons game exploration, stuff like that. Let's look into it. So the story begins in California, particularly around Berkeley, Fresno area and all that, particularly in Berkeley. Our main characters are Dick and Carol. There's a young couple there, Dick works at a magazine publication while Carol works, she does photography. She lives in an underground basement apartment, what have you. They've been together for about 9-10 months. But due to a quarrel over who voted for whom, Dick, Carol can't vote, but, his ballot was not to her approval, so they got into a fight. He leaves for a while, and when coming back to smooth it out, he finds out she's missing. So he waits for her. She doesn't come back at a normal time. He notices something different. Her camera, which she takes with her everywhere, is still there. There's a particular mark on the floor that wasn't there before. So he reports to the police. He tries to contact whatever friends he can, even going as far as Fresno to talk to a couple here who might know where she is. So far, no dice. And he eventually comes across a guy named Carl Hood, a guy he knows because he sends stuff to publishers at the magazine he works at. And while telling Carl everything he knows, he tells Dick that she may not be in the skin of this world anymore. Not knowing what he means by that, he goes back to Berkeley, where he meets a friend of his named Faye, and she, after informing her what the story is, of what's happened with Carol, she says the same thing. She may not be in the skin of this world anymore. Okay, things are starting to get weird. It's about to get weirder. She tells him how she asks how serious he is about finding her. He says, very. This is a girlfriend here who cares about her. Says, here's what you're gonna do. You got anything with weapon on you, with iron? Is it, I got a pocket knife. Okay, that will do. Bring food and water with you. Don't eat anything down there. And again, this is building up to kind of unusualness. She leads him down to a series of basements, down ladders and underground passages, and says, gives him instructions on what to do, and hopefully he can find Carol through there. How does she know any of this? We'll find out later. So Dick goes in, and along his way, he eventually right before he gets to further into the tunnels, he finds a sword, and this sword will come in handy here soon. The later of all the underground passages and stuff in the city later turns into underground caverns that no one ever knows about. And he crosses over this waterway, which acts as a barrier. And then he finds out that, from the beginning of the book, he explains that there are 3 kinds of beings down here. There are the ones that are black, there are gray, and there are green elves. And the green ones are worse. And what it is, these are the elves of old, what the legends are based under. One of the things that they normally feed off of is atticorn, this grain meal that they're not supposed to eat. And but the other thing that they also eat is human flesh. That's most likely what's happened to Carol. So he goes in there. You see some of the black elves here, which he fights off. They're not high and mighty token ass. No, they're kind of more vicious, primitive-like creatures here. So while going through that, with a sword coming in much more handy than just a regular sword. Upon his journey, he meets another captive here, another human captive who tries to who tries to help him out, but falling out there, but I'll let you read details of that. Eventually finds Carol, and while trying to escape with Carol, he meets up with Carl Hood at the waterway barrier. And he's trying to say, oh, hey, Dick, I'm here. You probably are hungry. Here, eat this. Carol is like, no, don't trust him or anything. He's like, but, hey, this is Carl, so he picks up the drink there and, eats, the burger that is given to him. And then Carl Hood says, oh, well, you're now stuck here. He's like, what do you mean? Well, they were a bit of I haven't eaten any of the food that they provide here. Well, it doesn't take much. It was traces of it on my hand I put on the food, and now you ate it. Now you're stuck here. You can't cross this waterway now. But she could. And So he also kind of finds out a little bit of the sword. Apparently, the sword is an enchanted sword, and Carl Hood claims that it's his sword. But in long story short, Dick cannot escape here now that he's taken a little bit of the Addercorn. He can't cross the barrier physically, but with Carl Hood, he could take Carol with him. Under the circumstances, Carl's like, yeah, just do that just to get her out, even though he's not sure what Carl has to do with any of this. But he's now stuck with the underground with the Dark Elves. So now Dick is now stuck with in an underground area, and he's going through. Eventually he runs out of food. He didn't take much with him. He figured he can get Carol and out before that, but again he ran out. So now he's stuck eating the outer corn as his only food, and the outer corn gives him apparently these hallucinations where he sees himself transform into different animals and what have you. And he goes through this vicious cycle of, eats the corn, gets hallucinations, snaps out of it, he gets tired, he finds a resting spot for a while, but then, comes out hungry, he has to go through it again. And it's like that for a while. Eventually he does meet a gray dwarf who tries to get him separate from the sword, and that's where he learns from a dwarf of this other artifact called the Glanestone. The dwarf tries to trick him, but he fails and he comes back. Dick eventually does find a way to break from his habit of the outer corn effects and eventually get out. And when he does, he meets up with Faye, and he finds out through Faye that the world has passed 3 years since he started searching for Carol. And because the effects of the outer corn has lost all sense of time. And he finds out from her that, Carol is still with Hood, so now he's got to find a way to rescue her from him, finds out a little bit more of what he's doing. And eventually it all comes down to, the world that he's now comes back to after 3 years has turned to a totalitarian, authoritarian state. So, your papers got purple ID, you got a job, everyone's on a computer, it's all a dystopian hell now. So now, Dick is trying to get his girlfriend to snap out of the conditions that she's in. He has to finds out a little bit about what the sword is and and what have you. How does Faye know about anything of the underworld? What is Carl Hood's ulterior motive? Can they stop him? And most importantly, what's Dick and Carol going to do when because they're now stuck in between these two harsh worlds. They're stuck in their world, which is now a totalitarian state, and they're stuck in and they're also in between the elven world, where they may come back and abduct and attack him and all that. Now here in the back of this book, the invasion of the hallucinogenic people from under Earth, and you read this and they came from under Earth to take over the world. And you kind of get the impression that this is going to be a great attack or a battle across their local area, across the world. It's not like that. It's a bit more subtle. So again, what, as I said, is about what are these two going to do as an antidote of being stuck in between a rock and a hard place as they are. So with that said, that's kind of a good summation of the book here. And I'm leaving out a lot of details out of that, but that's for you to read and enjoy. So, again, this is a book that Gary Gygax put in his appendix in, and there was some reason about this. It has a lot of things that early D&D players are familiar with, bringing in proper supplies on that. It does also show the myths about with the fairies and elves in a different way about going into the world, time is different, and that, don't eat the food there. It's an interesting take on that, taking that old folklore and putting it in a different context on how that works. But going back to Gygax, you were dealing with underground passages, long stretches of long hallways, finding artifacts, meeting interesting people. For those who D&D players, this is going to sound very familiar. But it's not in a typical fantasy world. This is sort of an alternative our world here, where, in the late 60s, and 3 years later, it turns into a totalitarian society, and as well as you got these underground creatures that had one person maybe trying to take over a little bit. But don't expect that to be the main climax of the story. But I think it may feel like an oddity, but once you get past that, there's going to be a lot of things you're familiar with here. And I think you're going to enjoy this as a one-off story. Will the two find something that will get them out of their situation or make their lives a little easier? Again, I'll leave that to you. The Shadow People by Margaret St. Thank you all for watching. Have a nice day.